Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin, and I have my coffee. And let's get started. Today, I'm excited for a conversation with my guest. My guest today is Ty Smith. Ty, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Hey, folks. Thanks for having me on the show. I also have my coffee, uh, my Uber open source branded
Oh,
mug.
oh man, already with the really good swag. I think we're gonna have to
Right?
figure out how to get some of those.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. I'm Ty Smith. I work at Uber. I am the Android platform lead for our developer platform group. I've been at Uber 6 years now. I'm also the chairperson of our open source technical steering committee, which I think is maybe going to have some interesting conversation here today. Been working mostly in mobile related technologies the last 12 years or so. So my main customer is developers. I serve all of our many hundreds of mobile engineers and think about how to make the developers' lives easier every day.
That's awesome. I want to really get into how a company like Uber, navigates the open source landscape, and I think that's going to be a great conversation. One of the things that I want to start off with is kind of, I'd love to hear from you your origin story into tech. So, for a lot of our guests, it's like depending on what generation they're from, like code CDs in the mail, or the idea of like having to build like Commodore 64s and all that sort of stuff. But I'd love to hear from you. What was that moment for you? Like you came across technology and you decided like this is it. Like this is the thing that I want to be attached to the rest of my professional life.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I feel like I'm pretty fortunate to have had a lot of exposure at a pretty young age that kind of set my passion and my career velocity up where it is today. I remember back as far as when I was 5 or 6 years old, and my dad had I think at the time, maybe a DOS or Windows 3.1 maybe had just come out, like a Pentium 1. So this was probably 92,
Okay.
I would think. And we had a big lightning storm, and it fried the motherboard of the machine.
Oh
And
no.
my dad, he was a tinkerer and an engineer as well, not a software engineer, but he was happy to get into computers and electronics and stuff. And I remember a project when I was about that age where we replaced the motherboard together. And I was just, a goofy kid that was just helping out dad. But it really did set up kind of an interest. And after that, I spent a lot of time on the computer. We had internet at a very early age for me. I feel fortunate because I think a lot of folks from my generation didn't exist online as
Sure.
early as I did. But I think that in many ways I kind of relate more to current generations for having that exposure from as far as I can remember. And then as a kid, I was just fascinated with old games and started learning to build websites by probably 9 or 10. Started hacking around at first in like WYSIWYG editors, and then getting into HTML, and then getting
Yeah.
into like early things like JavaScript or like scripting macros. And so by 11 or 12, I actually took on some contracts to like build websites for people for money.
Okay. All
um,
right.
just like extended family, like friends of family, like that sort of clients. So nothing too much. But then I was continually like just learning and exploring and tinkering and building as a kid. And by the time I was in early high school, I was in a small town in Texas, but they had a huge amount of resources for being a small town.
Sure.
So I had 3 years of computer science in high school, 2 years of networking, um, multiple years of like computer animation, and I was working full time for a local IT shop doing computer repair and like networking local like banks and businesses and doing their like website design for their clients, like local churches and small businesses. And so I had a ton of exposure during that time. And so by the time I went off to college, for software engineering, I was working full time in the day for like salaried as an engineer, and then doing night school. And so I did that for 4 years, and then just like jumped out hard into like Silicon Valley right after that. Started doing hopping around some startups, and then landed in some big tech companies.
So it sounds to me like you very much have the hustle gene, right? The whole idea of taking classes in college at the same time where you have a salaried like full-time job. Like the goal of the at the end of the 4 year university or college is to have the job, but you already have the job lined up. That's I mean that's really I think is it's I think that gives a little bit of depth into like who you are as a person. Is like I wanted to exceed this particular level of where I am, right? So
Yep.
do you think that that's um, you mentioned your father was an engineer and a bit of a tinkerer. Do you think that kind of that feeling of like always wanting to explore the next thing? Do you think that definitely has kind of been handed down to you generationally?
Definitely. I come from like a long line of engineers,
Okay.
and also people with the hustle gene, as you called it.
Yeah.
I was doing 15 semester hours and a 40-hour work week. I look back on college now and like, how the hell did I
Yeah.
survive? It was so exhausting. Um, but my dad was the same way. He always had multiple side businesses going on, and like really interesting investment opportunities, and always jumping into the next thing. So I think a lot of that I kind of got from the upbringing, um, and then I've continued that on to a more limited degree. I've definitely learned sustainability, especially as I've gotten into the more senior roles and I'm mentoring a lot of other folks.
Yeah.
A lot of that becomes really important. But still do a lot of things on the side involved in source, and I do a lot of like angel investments and advise other companies. So I still keep the hustle going a little bit, but
Yeah.
not what I was doing during college.
Well, I think you've kind of exposed where you live, so I'll drill on that a little bit. Like that, like if you live in that area of the country, I think you do have to always have your ear to the ground, right? Because I think there is something to say that within a few months the landscape can change, and you know there's always opportunities there, right? Whether they're
Absolutely.
good or bad opportunities, it's always good to be aware of what the next technologies are coming, the new companies that are coming, the new venture capitalist firms that are looking to invest. I think of the Silicon Valley or the Bay Area in general as like, oh, that's like literally the place where if you just pay attention, you could be very, very successful, right? And I think that's probably challenging for a lot of folks in our space because we focus a lot on just doing the work, and when we're done with the work, we go about the rest of our lives, right? And I think it takes that next level of interest in the field, in the space, to want to continually educate yourself or kind of continue your learning. And I think that's really you definitely seem like a prime candidate for somebody who is probably going to be retired, but not really retired, right? Like,
Oh yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I always say that I want to move off from having a day job to just being a part-time consultant for tech companies at some point.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. That's
but
definitely
you brought
interesting.
up a really interesting point around like the culture here and
Yeah,
the like network and the opportunities. When I was making the decision to move out to San Francisco at the time from the Dallas area, I was working for some local shops where I was, it was super early days of mobile. I was an Android engineer, it was like 2010, and I had this dream of like, I want to go to the center of tech culture. I want to
yeah,
like go out there, and I felt like a consumer of the culture at the time. Like I was building stuff, I was using the technology, I was online, but I didn't have that like innate feeling that I was like a contributor to the culture. And coming out to the Bay, like I would say the most valuable thing that I gained was a network. Like it's just
yeah,
super easy to gain like a very influential network. And it almost felt like overnight I had this like inner change where instead of feeling like a consumer of tech that other people are putting out, I felt like I was a producer of that culture
yeah.
as well.
Yeah, I mean that's awesome. And I think I would love to kind of continue that origin story of when you moved to the Bay Area. I imagine at some particular point in time, maybe when you were, maybe it already happened when you were living in Texas, but you know, open source, obviously the concept has been around for many decades, but it
Yep.
really gained a ton of visibility and traction like at the time that you're mentioning, kind of like the early 2010s, maybe the late 2000 aughts, right? Where
Yep.
you see things like Google start to build things like Android. You see Linux be substantially more popular in the technology ecosystem. You start to see things like GitHub, entities like GitHub show up out of nowhere, right? And sort to build this mind share about open source. So do you remember like the first time you came across like open source as like a concept? and fully grasp it and was like, oh, this is kind of cool. I want to be a part of it.
I think it was definitely Linux first.
Yeah,
I was a as a in high school a gamer and programmer
sure.
and just all around tinker with computers, and so I ran many different Linux distros and
Yep.
explored that ecosystem in depth. So I think at first it was more of a consumption of that community. And then as I started getting in deeper into my programming career, more out of the learning phase into the like contributor phase, I think it was definitely kind of an organic buildup at that
Yeah.
point. And then I started working on Android in late 2008, I want to say, maybe early 2009. So it was very early days of Android. I think it was Android beta with like the first
Yeah.
prototype phones out. And I'd been doing like Rails work and some PHP and stuff like that before, so I was working in the open source communities a little bit with that. But I think that moving into Android, where you had this full open source operating system in the entire stack, that was like the first principle of it, was really alluring. And at the time, the developer tools were terrible. It was an awful experience, but it was like a very interesting promise. And I saw that promise and really became a specialist in that area. And that platform and the surrounding community that has evolved over the years have been very rewarding to engage in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty big, I don't want to say risk because that's probably not fair. It's a pretty big grasp to look to adopt a technology and really tether yourself to it early on, right? Because I remember Android 1.0 and I remember Cupcake and I remember like the first couple of revs of Android. And like initially, there wasn't a ton of people that were like, this is going to work. I think at the time, like the thought was, oh, like all the different phone companies will build their own proprietary operating systems, right? Or some version on top of Linux or whatever, right? And I think and Google decided to make this like, no, every phone should have this on there. Do you remember kind of obviously since you were a part of the community early on, was there just a lot of fanboy activity going on? Like people like this is definitely going to happen. Like it might take a little bit, but it's definitely going to happen. Obviously, it caught on. I think way faster than a lot of people anticipated as well.
Well, I would say I have my own very interesting story of why Android at the time, and I think it'll shed some light on that. So I was
Sure.
working at a consultancy in Dallas, who was run by Mecca Okereke. He's now a senior director at Google. He runs a lot of the Play Store stuff. He's very active on Twitter. Really good guy. I was working under him, and he was identifying clients with like big contracts, and so the company had mostly been doing iOS apps right before that because it was like the very early days of like the iOS App Store,
Sure.
and we'd been working with some clients, and so we had Zagat signed as a contract, which
Oh, okay.
is it was a restaurant review service based out of New York. They were doing like the published books for years and years and
Mm-hmm.
years, and they were like, hey, we see this mobile thing, we need to do this. And so we had built the first version, very first version, early days of the iOS app for them, and they then said, "Hey, this Android thing, it's about to launch. We need to get an app there as well." And Mecca came to me and he was like, "Hey, we have this contract for for doing the Android app for Zagat, and I know you're mostly doing like our backend stuff. You're doing Rails, but we had this contractor that we were going to pull in who had a conflict and he can't do the project anymore. So we're committed to this. We have a 3-month timeline. How do you feel about learning Android and shipping the first version of Zagat in 3 months?" And I was like, I don't think
Sure.
this is a I don't think you're asking my opinion on this. You're like,
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
we'll
Yeah.
sign the contract. And so there was a lot of friction with the first early versions, and it wasn't like the developer tools were a bad experience coming from doing like Rails, which was like very joyful at the time, like working in Ruby, and that was kind of their entire ethos was around the joy in programming. So it's a bit challenging, but working through that and really understanding like the hands-on value of having a phone and seeing it ship
Yeah.
and working in that, it did catch me. And then combine that with the open source and the direction that I could see the industry going, where so many things besides phones could be Android. It's a lightweight, mobile, modern operating system
Mm-hmm.
that's like
Yep.
extensible. And so I started to get involved there. Part of it was I was more in demand at that point, right? Because it was very early and I now had a specialty. And
Sure.
so, I was then poached from that company to another company to like build an Android app at like a much higher dollar value amount.
Yeah.
And it was super competitive, right? Because you can't, if you're a dime a dozen backend engineers, you're not as in demand. And so I kind of kept with it for the first couple of years because the opportunity and the pay were very high for a specialist domain. And then during that time, the community was starting to really build up and catch up. And when I moved out to the Bay Area, I became very active in organizing a lot of the groups that kind of became the foundation of what the Android open source community is today, because I had just had that opportunity to be in there so early.
Yeah, I mean, it's not probably mentioned in the same, I guess, level of like the dot com boom in the 2000s, but like that 2008 to like 2012 time frame when like the phone like you mentioned, the iPhone came out, first versions of Android came out. Like it's really just this re-envisioning of how computing can be modernized, right? And I think obviously the last 10 years of Web 2.0 evolving with JavaScript and CSS and HTML and HTML5, it's really interesting to hear your insight on like, yeah, like there was a community that needed to get built, but I think there might have been, and maybe I'm paraphrasing, there's some trepidation from the larger like tech industry because I guess there it is a lot of risk, right? Because the assumption is like, okay, everybody's going to have one of these phones in their pockets, and I don't know if that was inherently clear. I think Steve Jobs mentioned it like constantly, but I don't know if there's a lot of buy-in at the consumer level and the developer level specifically.
It's also a different paradigm for developers to work in. Moving to mobile from being a backend engineer, there's a lot of overhead to that. There's a
Yeah,
lot of different constraints that you have to care about in technology. It typically moves a lot quicker in a
yeah,
consolidated manner because you have two big platform players that are pushing it forward, and because you have like smaller communities, people typically kind of run off of each other's ideas there, and it moves pretty quickly in kind of a consolidated way. So, going from back end to mobile, there is quite a gulf that needs to be
yeah,
crossed. And at the time, that was even more true than it is today because of the lack of resources and the lack of people that had done that jump and the immaturity of the tools at that point. It was a lot more analogous to building, and still is in many ways, desktop software than
sure.
it is your stereotypical, full stack web developer.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned something too. Like you're very dependent on a larger entity not moving your cheese or breaking your stuff, right? And
Yeah.
I imagine very, very early on, and like each version of Android would break every app that existed, right? So like this whole idea of having to constantly be aware of what's going on at Apple, what's going on at Google, and like okay, when they ship this new version of the software, all the phones are going to be forced to update. So is my app going to just work, or is there some API that I'm depending on that's completely changed and I have to update my app before so it's available on launch day?
Fortunately, Apple and Google take very different philosophies around the engagement with their developer communities. And it really shows in this sort of example that you brought up. For a while, Google was like, "Hey, we're putting out versions. We'll release these to public when we release them, and maybe if you know somebody internally, you get like a little more information." And Apple's always been very closed off the walled
Sure.
garden. Like information comes out when it comes out. They don't typically build a lot of company to company relationships that get more privileged information than the general public, even internally. They silo team information from other teams. So that's evolved a lot. Where today, Google actively works with all of the big companies. They have many forms of communication, from DevRel to involvement in private Slacks to customer advisory boards that we sit on, where we get like very early access to stuff and they're seeking our feedback, and they're even giving us product pitches of like, hey, if we built something like this, how would you use
Yeah.
this, or what would this look like? And it's really helped that be a two-way street, where Google's recognized that because Android is open source and they have this very flourishing community, the community is one of the reasons that why modern Android development looks like it does today.
Yeah.
A lot of the standard tools that Google recommends are not built by Google. It's like, hey, use this library from Square, or use this library from Uber,
Yep.
or
Hmm.
or whatever. even as they're talking about like their branding for Jetpack libraries, which is their kind of umbrella term for a lot of these libraries that they've been modern libraries they've been putting out over the last few years. They have allowed some community ones to take on that branding as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the next, I guess, step in this progression, right? Like, the idea of there are um, tactical third party or open source or whatever you want to call them, non Google created packages that are canonical to literally everything that people build. Like, I'd imagine there's a handful of really highly visible APIs that every app probably needs access to that aren't written by Google. And I think it's really, really important that Google is aware, like, and I think your comment that you made about how Google is like accepting of this and they want to build on top of that, because I think it's smart from a business model perspective. Like,
I agree.
let the community just add stuff to your platform, and you get to kind of, I don't want to say reap the rewards because that's not fair, but you want to but you want to have a positive experience for your end user, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and this kind of dovetails into kind of the next area that I'd like to talk about, where you mentioned you work at Uber now, and you wear a couple of hats at Uber, and I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on. We've delved a little bit into it on the Android side, but especially on the open source side, I'm very, very curious on how a company like Uber, how they navigate the open source landscape. I think a lot of people, maybe rightfully so, maybe not, don't even think about Uber and open source in the same vein, right? Even in the technology space.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think actually the two topics relate to each other. At least my background to them do. So maybe I'll give a long-winded answer to a
Sure,
little bit of
that's
that.
fine.
So uh, when I joined Uber in 2016, early 2016, it was kind of in a hyper growth mode and didn't have a lot of engineering maturity processes. It was bursting at the seams from scaling problems, and they were trying to like grow and patch that on and allow themselves to scale at the same time. And with that being said, the constraints in shipping mobile code are much harder from a reliability perspective than backend code. It's because when you ship a mobile app, you can't really hotfix that. It takes a while to go through like App Store review processes, and then when it gets into the hands of customers, the update period that the customers follow usually takes weeks before you might get your new version of the application in the hands of the majority of customers.
Yep.
Many customers, especially in emerging markets where they don't turn on auto update because network costs are higher. So you may have like very old versions of the app that live in the wild for a very long time. So if you ship a bug or a crash or a security vulnerability, it has the potential to live for a very long time. And because of that, because Uber was a utility, it wasn't like the other big companies at the time like Facebook or Twitter, where it's a consumption product where if Twitter goes down, like that sucks, I want to tweet about something funny, but people's livelihoods were dependent on Uber. Like they couldn't drive that day and they needed that to like put food on the table, or people would take it to like a medical appointment, or go to work. It's this utility. So there was this ethos at the company, that a cultural value that it should be as reliable as running water, which I think is a little funny because you look at many markets that don't have good running water, but
Sure.
you kind of you do understand what they were getting at. And because mobile has this, we were first in establishing a ton of engineering maturity processes at the company and in the industry that led the way. Now, a lot of that was like convergence of the architecture and a monorepo and the pipelines and all of the like guardrails for the APIs and the linters and all of this sort of stuff, and overall processes. But a lot of that was engagement with the external community in open source. And so we were hitting these scaling problems with a lot of the tools because Uber was hyper growing, and all of these contributors were working in a handful of apps. And that's pretty unusual, even at the time, compared to like Google or other big companies, because they spread their engineers amongst a large number of apps. But we operated in all these different regions. You had all these different like geographic experimentation running. So there were teams that were hundreds of teams were just contributing to a small handful of apps. And so the developer tools were bursting at the seams, and we couldn't use industry standard stuff. And so we evaluated, we tried to work with external companies, but things just didn't make sense at the time back then. And so we built and open sourced a lot of what we were working on, like our mobile architecture. And we moved to Facebook's build system at the time, and had some open source projects around migration from Gradle to Buck, which is their build system. And and we really started working with the community to make sure that because we were wasting engineering time by having to rebuild these things internally because we couldn't use the
Yeah.
external thing.
Yeah.
And so that really starts to establish the philosophy of how Uber and some of these other big companies should healthily view open source, which is, you know, it's not just a retention thing or a hiring thing that you're active in open source. We literally needed that to scale our business because the external tools did not satisfy the requirements. And by us getting involved in open source, we had a hand on the steering wheel. We could ensure that, the tools coming out would satisfy the engineering needs. And so that's been kind of the foundation of how we grew both our open source involvement. We open source our own projects that have wide adoption, but we've also engaged in other companies' products or foundation projects that we heavily use so that they meet our needs. And we continue to have very close working relationships with a lot of our tooling companies. We have like shared Slack channels. We're constantly working with them on different projects, and various open source tools. And so, if you view that from just the technology side, not the process side, you're like, okay, I could kind of see how that makes sense. But then in parallel, Uber was trying to mature the overall processes of the company. And part of that was moving from a handful of engineering leaders that were the open source reviewers. So I was one of like 4 people at the time that teams would be like, hey, I want to open source this thing. And it was very ad hoc. We'd like look at it, make sure it, kind of met some best practices that we'd thrown together, and, approve it or not. But, that doesn't scale very well, just having these handful of like open source gatekeepers. And, we started to look into the more mature models that other companies have gone through. And we formed an open source program office, and we put together, a lot of process in place and how we evaluate projects and how we work with foundations and how what it's like to donate a project to a foundation, what inbound open source looks like, like what are the licenses we can consume from, and we established that original group of engineers became the technical steering committee, so that we work closely with the open source program office to evaluate and kind of steer the ship for the overall direction technically that we're pushing, and then kind of create process and tech and work with projects as it relates to that.
I mean, there's a lot there, and I really appreciate, you mentioned it was going to be long-winded, but there's a lot of really tangible bits that I want to kind of take out of there. One of the first things that you mentioned that I think is, when I think of open source, I think of, okay, so why would somebody want to get started in open source? Probably one path for folks is that they are looking for a tool that does something, and that tool does not exist. So they build that tool for themselves, and then they eventually see, oh, well, I probably, like, other people probably can make use of this tool as well. So they quote unquote open source it, right? And it seems to me that obviously at a macro level, Uber did a very similar thing. Hey, the existing build infrastructure of some of these other tools does not meet our criteria for a plethora of reasons. So let's see what we can do in making this more sustainable for ourselves, and hopefully the greater community can take advantage of it. And I think that's really impressive, because a lot of companies, at least from my experience, they take this different approach where they look to open source tooling or things that can directly lead to the consumption of their products. But like there's literally no revenue stream for the build tools of Uber. I mean, to be fair, there probably is some, because if you can't ship the apps, you can't make any money. But at the same time, like, you're not making direct revenue from that infrastructure, right? You don't sell it as a service.
Absolutely. And so I work in the infrastructure org by day. I say that by night I do all of the open source technical steering committee. It's my volunteer job at the company. But by day I run our Android platform team, which is under infrastructure. And at the scale that we are, with many thousand engineers, there isn't a lot of variance in what's needed to open source something versus just to put out a developer tool or a developer product. You're thinking about a lot of the similar traits and documentation and best practices and how people would use it, and what migrations from versions look like, and change logs and all of that sort of thing. And so typically when we're building new tools, first it starts with an evaluation of the product space. It's, hey, we want to, we want to do this thing. What industry tools exist
Yep.
that we can evaluate? And if there is a great one that is kind of the industry standard that just works, that's awesome. Maybe we can just integrate that. But if it doesn't, typically there's like, what are those gaps?
Yep.
And those gaps could be so large and fundamental that we need to build a competitor to the thing. But more
Sure.
typically, it's like, hey, it doesn't meet this one use case or these two use cases, or we need to rethink this. And then that's a great opportunity for a platform team to invest in improving that tool and open sourcing that work so that the community can benefit. But if we kind of go the other route where it's, hey, we need to build this thing because either the open source tool fundamentally wouldn't work for us, or there isn't a good tool for this, then the first question early in the design process, it's actually in our design docs, are what is the open source applicability of this? We want folks to think about from the very beginning, more of like, why wouldn't I open source this? Then why would I? And
Yeah.
when you design software in that model, then you end up with a lot of like generic, mature, highly opinionated tools to do certain things that can work very well in the community. And then what we've seen is a lot of those projects go on to do very successful. We've donated many projects to like the Cloud Native Foundation, started multiple foundations. We've had folks leave Uber and then start startups based on the open source software that we put out.
Yeah.
So that I think helps foster the quality that goes out.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. It sounds to me like the opinion is to build open source first, right? Build this concept, build the concept of like, okay, can this tool exist in the wild as open source? And if the answer systemically is yes, you have two audiences then. You have your internal audience, which is going to have to at some point consume said tool, and then you have your external audience that may or may not want to contribute to it, may or may not want to provide feedback on it. And those are really challenging things to navigate, right? Because at the size of Uber as a company, I'd imagine that the open source repositories that you have lots and lots of stars, lots and lots of different feedback or contribution mechanisms, right? So from your perspective, like how is the best way for a company that size to manage it? Is it a set, like, do you have teams that their responsibility is managing open source repositories? Or is it more you have the product groups, they also kind of are co-maintainers of these open source libraries?
It's a great question. First, I'll clarify that often when that decision is being made, there's an evaluation criteria that's
Sure.
applied
Yes.
to make sure that what we're putting out, we want to have our name behind, right? So, we want a level of quality and industry standards and adoption and other things that we would expect. So just throwing something over the fence and not having it maintained or having it kind of violate the overall direction that we're wanting to go is not something that we're interested in. So there's a set of, a thorough set of criteria and how we evaluate these. And it looks very similar to the criteria you would look at if you're going to like donate a project to Cloud Native Foundation or Linux
Yep.
Foundation on like how they stage them as like, incubating projects versus like the mature projects. We have a set of tiers, and in those, we have recommendations for how long something would be internal in production with certain criteria before it would be considered for open source. But I want to clarify that, when I said earlier, you're thinking about open sourcing from the very beginning, you probably did, and that's around not assigning a different quality bar to something internal versus something external. Often I see this at companies where you're like, hey, I built this thing, but if we wanted to open source this, we'd really need to go clean it up. We need to add a bunch
Yep.
of tests. We need to add a
Mhm.
bunch of docs. And that is where, we want to remove that gap so that when we're building something internally, the overhead to turn around and open source that is very low. That doesn't mean that we still don't want it battle tested in production or other things like that. But then there's a set of projects that we do decide to develop in the open from the very beginning.
Sure.
So we've had a handful, especially coming out of the mobile infrastructure team, where we've been communicating with folks at, Google or Airbnb or whatever, and they're like, there's really a need for this thing. And we decided, let's do something in the open. So we had our own DI tool for iOS that's pretty popular called Needle, which is kind of inspired by Dagger. It was developed in the open from the beginning. There's been a handful of other projects like that. I wouldn't say it's the majority, but that is one type of approach to that problem.
Yeah, I mean, and I thank you for the clarification there. I think that the crux of my statement was more along the lines of, to your expect, like you just can't throw code out there and expect any sort of positive feedback, right? You need a framework in place. You need, if you want or open to contributions, you need
Yep.
a contribution guidelines. You need documentation on how to stand this up if you wanted to stand it up yourself. Like there's a whole gamut of like checks that you have to go through to make something
Yep.
open source. Even if you're just like a single person and want to have a tool that gets used by people, like just throwing some code out there with like a README with a few things in there isn't really valuable. But at the end of the day, like you need substantial guidance for people that are coming there to consume it. And it's just
Yep.
that it's extrapolated extremely when you're dealing with a company the size like 1,000 developers. I don't know what the number in millions is of active people who interface with your different technologies from an open source perspective, but it's probably millions. Um, I think one of the things too that's really interesting to kind of segue away from like how you build like open source at Uber is like how do you like foster open source adoption in at tech companies? Because that's something that I love to talk about because everybody has a different opinion or a different methodology to how the best way to engage and um, gather support for open source. Like,
Yep.
and since you've been fairly it's probably this is not offensive, so don't take it as offensive. You're very mature in the open source space for the amount of time that you've been in it. And I'd love to get your thoughts on like depending on company size, large or small, like what are some preferred paths to adopting open source, and maybe what are some of the things that Uber has done that's been good, maybe some things Uber has done that hasn't been, or was more of an opportunity that was missed.
Sure. I think I have a lot of thoughts in this space. Let me start by clarifying. We do have, and maybe this is the final answer to what you'd asked before, but it feeds
Sure.
really nicely into this question.
Of course.
Um, we organize between product teams and platform teams typically, and product
Sure.
teams don't often have a lot of open source ownership when it comes to like owning a project that they're
Yep.
maintaining. They may commit a contribution, a fix, something like that, right? That from a tool that they're using, but typically they're not a maintainer long term for a project. But when we are open sourcing projects, we are asking the questions to figure out about long term maintainership, and not throwing it over the fence. So there are questions around staffing and roadmaps, and you have teams that are like dedicating headcount to these projects. And I think that is kind of the foundation of some of what you're asking now, which is if you are trying to foster open source and you do not have dedicated maintainers or owners, even from a consumption perspective, even if it isn't like I'm going to build this thing and put it out there, then you can run into a lot of challenges because you'll have internal issues with usage of that maintainership, maybe a migration that needs to happen. So first I would say one of the paths towards that is dedicated POCs for the open source consumption and production, maybe at a smaller company. If I was going to give some like blanket guidance, then I would think about the consistency and how you're consuming. So one thing that we have done well, I think, is we have monorepos, like mega repos, I guess. We have one per platform. So like an Android monorepo, an iOS monorepo, a Go, Java, and web. And there are, as part of that, you get kind of centralized dependency management as one of the like perks of a monorepo. And on top of that, you can then have centralized teams or dedicated headcount that's associated with the third-party dependency management, where you start to get into those quality gates. So in mobile, I mentioned earlier, we have very high quality bar because the long tail for updates is very high. So we also have a very strict process, or not process, a very strict bar for what it looks like to use a third-party library. We have a lot of third-party libraries. We're using industry standard ones. Engineers do bring in new ones, but it isn't just the Wild West where people are pulling these in.
Sure.
There's there's a design doc that needs to be filled out. We've automated tooling on the licensing. We use FOSSA right now. There's an evaluation of the quality, how it's been maintained, the additional size it'll add to the binary, additional network costs, performance profiling, all of these different quality traits that we expect to be evaluated in one of these projects before we pull this in. And that is maybe a stricter bar on mobile than we've seen in some of our backend repos, where you can hotfix if you need it, and maybe there's teams that have varying levels of like dependency versions, and there's a little more fragmentation because the constraints aren't quite as high. And so that's one area I've seen Uber do really well in mobile, and maybe there's some more maturity to be had in part of our domains. But I would turn around and advocate for like a newer company or a smaller company if they're thinking around how do we want to foster open source consumption, not even like producing of this. Think about that consistency and the quality bar and like what you expect, and then who are those POCs and those maintainers internally that are going to be the ones responsible when there's questions or when a migration breaks an API in like a downstream thing, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean it's all really fascinating because I think the goal at the end of the day is pretty straightforward. It's not redo work, right? And I think at the end of the day, there's probably been some scenarios where maybe all of the existing third-party libraries didn't meet every criteria. Maybe one wasn't as performant. Maybe, like you mentioned, the binary size was too big. Maybe for whatever reason, the maintainership didn't seem up to the satisfaction of the team. So how often does it actually happen where a team will have to, kind of write a utility when there are a plethora of other utilities out in the market that do something similar?
We find it quite often with
Yeah,
product-focused libraries.
sure.
So especially in mobile. So typically a company whose end product is software integration, they will put out their REST API or whatever for developers to hit. They'll often put out mobile SDKs as well. And so these mostly are open source, but often we run into companies where they don't even open source them. It's just like, hey, here's an SDK that you need to integrate so that you can with our product. That's a huge point of friction in mobile because of those constraints that we talked about, where you need the quality bar and you need care about binary size and all of the other things. So for those types of products that have like a REST API, and we run into this, Uber takes different forms of payment in different markets, so there's like a lot of like payments provider integration or metric integration with or different things like that. And a lot of the time we look at those third-party libraries that they produce to consume their API, and instead decide to write a very light wrapper around their REST API that uses our practices. But that's like very specific. That's like a product-focused SDK to consume. For things that are more generic or utility-based, I think that's a lot less common. There's a lot of those that could be one-off. It's just like a generic framework. Like I need an image loader library, right? It's probably not going to get built internally. That would probably be a waste of engineering resources. There's multiple very mature ones for Android and iOS, and if it's lacking something, like that's a great opportunity to open source that. But when you get into some of the more like fundamental tooling and technology that things are really built on, I think that's where sometimes you need to take a multi-year view of the technology, and you could find yourself in a place where you're deciding that you don't want to build on someone else's like fundamental piece of technology, and so you're gonna build something else internally. That's pretty rare, honestly. Like even right now, we're migrating our build system from Buck, which was Facebook's open source build system, to Bazel for Android. Most of our other repos have already migrated, and that would be one of those examples where it's moving from one large open source project with like years of integration work to another that's like it's a multi-year project just to do that migration, but moving to something that's more industry standard than was what there before. And at no point did we think to ourselves, hey, let's build our own build system.
Well, I mean, I guess you could if you want to. Some companies have been, I don't want to use the word forced, but some companies have been felt obligated to do so, like you mentioned Facebook, for instance.
And we've contributed a ton to Buck, and we will be debating. Like it's missing a lot of things to do mature mobile development, and we've been adding those. But that's a great opportunity to contribute, not to try to build something, throw something else over the wall that isn't the industry standard.
Yeah, I like to think of it like this too, that like obviously Uber has a core competency, right? Or maybe one or two core competencies, right? But there are all of these other utilities or mechanisms that are de facto needed. Like you need logging frameworks, you need geolocation frameworks. You need all these other things that, sure, if you wanted to, Uber could write the whole gamut. But at the same time, enough companies have leveraged this logging framework or this mechanism to, for a user experience perspective on mobile apps, right? So the need to rebuild that or kind of customize it to your concerns is still something that's probably talked about a lot. Like, this does 9 out of the 10 things we want to do. Can we live with missing that one, or we can abstract it and maybe build something that's a bit more bespoke?
And the other issue that you just brought up is often when you're doing that evaluation and you're comparing something that's either industry standard or that has a company behind it, the resourcing going to that external thing is going to be higher than what you
Yeah,
get internally. So even
sure.
if it's missing one feature today, if you look at the life of this technology in your infrastructure, look out, project out 3 years. What does it look like then? You've had this external thing that has a ton of companies rallying around it, and it's evolved significantly faster with more feature set than your internal one that maybe you have half a headcount staffed on it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's resourcing is always a problem. Even on like the library side, right? Like you mentioned, let's just pick some random, project. Okay, a lot of companies are using it, but it's like four dudes that are doing this at, maybe one works at Google, maybe one works at some smaller company because they all went to college and they decided to build some little package and now it's used by every big company on the face of the earth. So like how do you resolve that situation where you're very dependent on the, I don't want to say free because it's not fair to say free. How do you how do you when how do you manage that expectation when your dependency is a very, very small team that has no affiliation at all with Uber other than being a downstream customer?
I think there's a lot of different ways that that could be approached, and I wouldn't say there's one consistent
Sure.
way to do. If it's a small one-off piece that doesn't have a stable maintainer team and it's very critical to infrastructure, that probably has got some resources internally that are dedicated to that thing.
Yeah.
Either they've built something similar, or they're contributing to that, or they've forked it, or whatever that looks like. But if it's something in that state that's instead kind of being evaluated up front to pull in as new, then I think that speaks pretty strongly to the signals around like decision making in that. If you have four very active maintainers and they're from different companies, sure, that's totally fine. But is no one responding to issues that are filed? Is the project rotting? Would you be afraid of like timeliness
Yeah.
in issues that need to be mitigated? Those are some concerns that would start to be raised if you didn't see those signals. So we don't have a trait that's like, where are the
Hmm.
people that are maintaining this like employed? That would be silly.
Yeah.
But we do look at what is the activity in the project. How responsive are they? How do they care about their community? Are there forks of this because people couldn't get things landed, and they were forced to do that as an alternative? Like, those all speak to signals for evaluation of the health of the community.
Yeah, and when you transition after that evaluation phase to potential adoption, right? Like you think about like what are the long-term things that Uber can do to invest into the livelihood of this particular package. Like a lot of different companies different ways. They do maybe FOSS funding, or they do, they, like you mentioned, maybe they might attach one or two headcount to contributions um, in the in the spirit of open source. Like I think what you've seen, like what is the most effective way? And I know that's probably there's an answer that there's no really answer to that question more than likely, but I'd like to get your
I'll,
thoughts on like what's go ahead.
yeah, I'll give you an interesting one. So
Sure.
when we were originally migrating our build system on Android from the standard at the time, which was great, it still is the standard Gradle, but to Facebook's build system Buck, there was an open source tool that was just maintained by one guy. I think he was a student in China or something. Like, it was a tool called OKBuck, and it was just a
Oh,
very
okay.
prototype, nascent product it was a Gradle plugin that would output dynamically generated Buck files. And
Okay.
this became a very core piece of our infrastructure for
Sure.
managing that migration, and then years later for dependency management in still a buck-based system. And that kind of falls into that category you were talking about of like, hey, maybe there's like risk in the maintainers dropping off, or this project isn't as mature as you would want it, but it was very promising for what it was.
Mhm.
And we started contributing there, and then we ended up working with the author to take over the project. So
Yeah.
it's moved to our namespace, and we have fully dedicated folks on that now. And that has been a very very healthy project since. It has probably thousands of stars, and it's pretty successful. So I think that was maybe a more unusual approach, but I had seen that pop up before. We had a guy that came to Uber to take a job, and he had previously at a company where he was a Kotlin developer for backend, and he produced a linting tool called KT-Lint. And while he was working as a Kotlin developer at this smaller company, and he came to Uber, and he was going to be a Go developer, so he wasn't going to be
Sure.
working in Kotlin anymore. And he said he didn't have the time to continue to maintain KT-Lint, and it had got a lot of industry adoption at this point. Even we
Sure.
were using it; we were a consumer of it. And so he said, "Hey, do you guys want to take it over to my team?" And we were very under resourced at the time. Uber went through like a tumultuous few years after its hypergrowth phase with like a lot of attrition, and it was harder to hire. And there was a bad name for the company around like the delete Uber timeframe. And we unfortunately had to decline. We're like, hey, there's way too many things. We can't take on maintenance of this right now. We don't have the headcount. And but we worked with him and connected him with other companies that we're peers with, and it ended up they transferred it to Pinterest, who's maintaining
Oh,
it
okay.
now because they had the available headcount. And so that was another success story where you had a maintainer who's like, hey, I can't prioritize this anymore. And we were able to work with him and find it a good home, even if it wasn't us to maintain that.
Yeah, I mean that's an approach too. Like find act as a mechanism to find the right place long term. Like you mentioned another company. Like another option is like there are miscellaneous foundations that sponsor projects, right? OpenJS Foundation, Apache Foundation, .NET Foundation. Like their sole charter is to ensure the livelihood of well-known community projects, right? So
Absolutely.
being able to send, you know, a Kotlin package and make sure that has a life forever because, like you said, some very large companies are dependent on it is very important, right? Um,
Absolutely. We've helped found multiple foundations. I'm on the steering committee for the Mobile Native Foundation. We're
yep,
founding members of that. We've donated a lot of projects. Like that's a common end game for these projects when you have a team that has either changed priorities or you have maintainers who have left the company. Like that's a typical approach where you have something that has a lot of community value and has heavy adoption and is very mature. And there have been big projects that have moved to Apache or Linux Foundation or Cloud Native Foundation or Mobile Native Foundation that we've helped facilitate.
yeah, and I think that's like that next step in like completely being an open source technology company, right? It's like not if in situations where you can't help, you find the help or you find the avenues to ensure success in the ecosystem. Because I think one of the things that a lot of people do, unfortunately, is they take open source for granted. And then things happen and packages get deleted or packages get deprecated and it breaks a lot of software. So
Absolutely.
instead of going down that path, you go down the path of instead ensuring that there's an ecosystem that's always thriving. And as we're getting close on time, I'd like to kind of ask you, kind of as kind of your closing thoughts on things. Is you know you've been in this space, the open source space, the Android space, the technology space for a while, and I'd like to get your thoughts on what's the best way for folks that maybe they're career changers, maybe they're looking to get into tech, maybe they're in school still. How important is open source as it pertains to their learning journey for getting or creating a successful livelihood in tech?
That's a great question. It I've seen it kind of waved around as a silver bullet, and I think that
Sure.
might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's a very powerful tool in a developer's tool belt. And they're depending on the community, they're different technologies have different communities. There's varying levels of opportunity from that network that would emerge. So what open source gives to a new developer, a person who's changing careers, is two things potentially. It gives them technology experience, a tool in their tool belt that they can use now and potentially use at a future company. So they're learning something. It gives them a network potentially of contributors, maintainers, where they can start to build out that network and get visibility. Maybe they have an opportunity because one of those maintainers is working at a company they want to work for. And then there's just like the general awareness or general reputation that kind of comes with that as well. So there's those three pieces. They kind of fit together. I wouldn't call them the silver bullet, but it's a useful way to capitalize on limited time when
Yes.
you're a new learner. I'll give an example. Many people will know my girlfriend Chloe Condon. She's a boot camp grad that turned into a developer advocate. That it was at Microsoft for a long time, and I helped mentor her through that entire process of going like learning first like Swift and some Android code, and then going to a boot camp, and then getting her first job in tech. And she had varying experiences with open source that helped her. But that wasn't just open source specifically. It was learning about the technology space and how it used open source and making the network that existed because of that. And then, she separately had the community that was facilitated by her own professional network or the boot camp's professional network. And the combination of all of these things start to give additive value for a new learner so that they can capitalize on that, because that first job is really the hardest for these folks.
Yeah.
Once you've developed a bit of skill and you become more in demand, especially once you've moved past the entry level to a more senior role, the tables really turn, and it becomes very difficult not to have a job for most folks,
Yeah.
as opposed to kind of
Yeah, I talk about this all the time. It's like there's not a deficit of jobs. There's a surplus of jobs. There's a lack in the folks that have the skills to do those jobs. So if you get more people skilled, get more people into tech, there's going to be a substantial innovation, or I guess you could say moment where potentially like we ran out of tech jobs and then we have a bigger problem to these to get resolved. But I don't think that ever happening. Also, like, I think one thing that companies can do as well, and I think that Uber is a great champion of this, is just like raising awareness in spaces, right? Like you mentioned, what making all of these investments in open source technologies, making these investments in communities around open source, like foundations and things like that, to kind of continue to foster like that continued learning experience. Back to the very, very beginning of our conversation with kind of like that hustle culture, right? Like you want people to feel like they have uh, tons of options as it pertains to getting started in a career in tech, not just one traditional path. And I think that's
I agree.
one of the things that I really, really appreciate about what you've been doing at Uber, and some of the things that you've been doing outside as well. Um, as we wrap up, I'd love to ask my guests one final question, and that question, it's sort of silly, so I apologize. But if you can think of your career in open source or tech, the community around it, and you only had one word to describe that feeling, what would that feeling or that word be for you?
Exciting.
Exciting.
I'm still pumped to do what I do, and many years later. Every person I talk to about the team, they're like, "Why are you still doing that? Like, you've been there a long time." I'm like, "I love it.
Sure.
Exciting. It's exciting. The work's hard. It's thrilling. It's challenging. The people are great. So exciting is a good word for that."
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I'm in the same vein of you a little bit. I think where if I get bored, I tend to figure something else out, right? And I think that as long as my brain is constantly on fire, I'm more than likely pretty happy. Even though I might be like panicking all the time or whatever. Like the panic is good panic.
That's true.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time on the show today, Ty. For folks who aren't already following Ty, it's T Smith on Twitter and probably a bunch of other places as well. As we part, do you have any last words, Ty?
No, thank you for having me on the show. If you're interested in this sort of open source work, we are hiring folks for our open source program office. So feel free to reach out.
Oh man, so you're saying that people that are watching this could potentially get a job at Uber? That is crazy.
Always hiring, but especially right now.
Awesome. Well, again, Ty, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate all the people that tuned in. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.